Spinoza did not deny God in the simple way many people think. He destroyed a smaller idea of God and replaced it with something far more radical. You have felt it, that quiet tension between what you were taught to believe and what your mind keeps asking. You were given a God who watches, who judges, who rewards obedience and punishes doubt. And for a while, perhaps that felt like enough. But then reason arrived, questions arrived, and suddenly the God you inherited began to feel too small for the universe you were actually living in. That tension did not mean you lost your faith. It meant your mind was growing faster than your inherited explanation could hold. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from trying to believe something that contradicts itself every time you think carefully. You want reverence. You want meaning. You want to feel that reality has order and that your life inside that order matters. But you were handed a God who seems angry, who seems absent, who demands belief while punishing doubt, who promises love but delivers fear. And so you end up torn, not between belief and atheism, between the God you were given and the one your deepest self suspects must be something larger, something truer, something that does not need your terror to prove its existence. What Spinoza offers is not a comfortable replacement. It is not a gentler story to soothe you back to sleep. What he offers is a lens so clear and so complete that the fear-based image of God begins to dissolve on its own. Not because someone mocked it, but because reason reveals something more vast in its place. This video will show you why his vision of God or nature felt threatening to every institution that needed your fear in order to maintain power. And why that same vision can feel like the first honest breath you have taken in years. The most common image of God that has been handed down through centuries of religion is essentially a human image placed very high up. A ruler, a judge, a father who sees everything and decides what you deserve. This image has enormous emotional power. It gives suffering a cause. It gives hope a direction. It gives morality an enforcer. But notice what it also requires. It requires that the infinite source of all existence behave the way a human authority figure behaves. It requires that the universe have preferences, moods, and reactions. That the force behind every galaxy, every cell, every heartbeat, be capable of being pleased or offended by the specific choices of one particular species on one particular planet. This is not an attack on the sincerity of those who hold that image. Sincerity is not the same as accuracy. A person can be completely sincere and still be working from an inherited picture that does not match what is actually there. The question Spinoza forces us to ask is not whether you believe in God, but which God you believe in. Because the God that was handed to you by fear, by authority, and by the need for social control is a very different thing from what reality itself might actually be. And mistaking one for the other is not humility. It is a very human error with very serious consequences. The real prison is not doubt. The real prison is anthropomorphism. The ancient, powerful, almost irresistible habit of imagining that whatever is greater than us must look and think like us, only bigger. When the thunder came, the early mind did not say, "That is atmospheric electricity." It said, "Something up there is angry." When the harvest failed, it did not trace the soil chemistry. It asked, "What have we done to deserve this?" This instinct is not weakness. It is how the human mind naturally works when it is trying to understand things that are too large and too complex for its current tools. But Spinoza understood something those ancient minds did not have words for. The imagination that creates meaning can also create chains. When you imagine God as a being who can be angered, you turn every misfortune into a punishment. When you imagine God as a judge with preferences, you turn every doubt into a sin. When you imagine God as a person who can be petitioned, you outsource your own power of understanding to an authority that may not respond the way you expect. And the tragedy is not that this image brings comfort. Sometimes it does. The tragedy is that it also brings a very specific kind of suffering. The suffering of someone who believes that the universe is watching them with conditional love, ready to withdraw at the moment they think the wrong thought. The hidden enemy inside this theology is fear, not the fear of genuine danger, which has survival value, but the fear of a God who must be constantly appeased. Spinoza saw this clearly. He watched a culture organized around spiritual terror and realized that the terror itself was the problem. Not the longing for God, not the desire for meaning, but the particular portrait of God that had been painted to keep people obedient, controllable, and permanently indebted to institutions that claim to manage the relationship between the human soul and the divine. That portrait, Spinoza said, was a human invention, and it was costing humanity its freedom. Look around today and the same tension has not resolved itself. It has simply changed clothes. You see it in the collision between scientific understanding and religious authority, where people feel they must choose between their intelligence and their reverence, as though reality itself demanded that choice. You see it in the crisis of meaning that comes when someone raised in a fear-based theology finally cannot sustain the belief and has nothing to replace it with. The collapse is not into freedom. It collapses into emptiness because the only God they were given was the God of punishment. And when that God stops making sense, they assume all sense of the sacred must go with it. You see it in the quiet exhaustion of millions of people who carry moral fear through their daily lives, who feel watched, who feel unworthy, who feel that something cosmic is keeping score. This is not a medieval problem. This is a present problem. The image of God as a remote, demanding, potentially wrathful authority is still shaping the inner lives of people who have smartphones and university degrees and access to all of recorded human thought. Because the image was planted early. It was planted before reason arrived. And early images do not dissolve simply because intelligence grows. They require examination. They require philosophy. They require exactly the kind of confrontation that Spinoza spent his life making. If this is beginning to name something you have felt but never fully articulated, press the like button now, not for the channel. For every other person carrying this same tension who needs to find this conversation. Baruch Spinoza was born in Amsterdam in 1632 into a Jewish community that had already survived forced conversions, exile, and the kind of terror that religion can produce when it is married to political power. He was a brilliant young man in a tradition that prized intellectual engagement with sacred texts. And yet, by the time he was in his mid-20s, the community excommunicated him with language so severe it has rarely been matched in recorded religious history. They cursed him, they expelled him, they forbade any contact with him. What had he done? He had looked at the inherited portrait of God and said, "This cannot be right." Not out of arrogance, out of the same desire for truth that the tradition itself claimed to value. And so he spent the rest of his short life. He died at 44, building one of the most complete and radical philosophical systems the Western world had ever seen. At the center of that system is a single enormous world-altering claim. God and nature are one and the same thing. Not similar, not analogous, identical. There is one infinite substance. It is the source and the content of all reality. It does not exist outside the universe looking in. It is the universe. It is the laws that govern it. It is the power that moves through every particle, every mind, every emotion, every moment of beauty, and every moment of pain. Spinoza called this God or nature, Deus sive natura, not to insult believers, but to show that the word God, stripped of the human projections layered onto it, points to something that is genuinely infinite, genuinely eternal, and genuinely necessary, not a king above creation. The reality of creation itself. In Spinoza's universe, nothing happens by accident. Nothing happens because a divine ruler is in a particular mood that day. Everything that happens follows necessarily from the nature of what exists. The stone falls not because God commanded it in that moment, but because gravity is a necessity written into the structure of existence. The emotion arises in you not because the universe is sending you a personal message, but because specific causes in your body, your history, your beliefs, and your environment have produced that particular effect. This is not a cold or meaningless picture. It is a picture of extraordinary order. An order so total and so deep that no part of reality is left unaccounted for. This matters emotionally because most human suffering around God comes from the sensation of arbitrariness. Why did this happen to me? Why did God allow this? Why does prayer sometimes seem answered and other times vanish into silence? These questions are agonizing precisely because they assume that reality is being managed by a will that could have chosen otherwise. Spinoza dissolves this particular agony not by saying the suffering did not happen, but by showing that reality is not being managed by preferences. It operates by necessity. The order is total. The causes are real. And your capacity to understand those causes is itself a form of participation in what Spinoza would call the mind of God. When you understand that reality operates by necessity, something shifts. The question stops being, "Why is God doing this to me?" and becomes, "What are the actual causes that produce this situation?" That is not a smaller question. It is a more honest one. And honest questions lead somewhere. They lead to understanding. They lead to causes you can actually trace and sometimes actually influence. Fear-based theology keeps the question unanswerable by design, because an unanswerable question keeps the believer permanently dependent on the interpreter. Spinoza breaks that dependency by returning the question to reality, where it belongs. Spinoza drew a distinction that is one of the most practically powerful ideas in the history of philosophy. He distinguished between passive emotions and active understanding. A passive emotion is one in which you are driven by causes you do not understand. You feel fear and you obey it. You feel guilt and you accept it. You feel awe at the image of a thundering God and you build your entire moral life around that awe. You are being moved. You are not moving yourself, and that, Spinoza said, is the definition of bondage. Not moral failure, not sin. Just the very precise condition of a mind that does not yet understand what is actually moving it. Active understanding is different. It does not mean you stop feeling. It means you begin to see. You recognize the cause of the fear. You trace the origin of the guilt. You examine the image of God you were given and ask, where did this come from? What need did it serve? What does it produce in me? Is what it produces in me freedom? Or is it a more sophisticated version of the same old prison? This is not coldness. This is the beginning of genuine inner freedom. And Spinoza said this was the highest form of human life. Not the life of obedient fear, but the life of active understanding, oriented toward what he called the intellectual love of God. The intellectual love of God for Spinoza is not performed in a temple, and it is not earned through ritual. It is the mind reaching its clearest, most adequate understanding of reality, and finding in that clarity a kind of joy that is completely stable. Not because the world has become perfect, but because the mind is no longer at war with what is real. When you understand that the force behind reality is not a moody authority waiting to be appeased, but an infinite, necessary, lawful order in which you yourself participate, the relationship to that reality changes entirely. The trembling stops, not because you have stopped caring, because you have started actually seeing. If you have spent years confused about God, you are not broken. You are not spiritually defective. You are not being punished with doubt as a form of divine discipline. You are a mind that inherited an image too small for the questions it naturally generates. And that is not a failure. That is what happens when a serious mind is given an explanation built for the management of fear, rather than the pursuit of understanding. The confusion is not the sign of a problem with you. It is the sign of a problem with the explanation. Spinoza would recognize you immediately. He lived inside the same tension at a far higher personal cost. He was not free to quietly question and then close the book and go home for dinner. His questioning led to one of the most severe acts of social destruction a community could perform. He was cut off from everyone he knew, from his tradition, from his family's world. And yet he did not respond with bitterness or cynicism. He responded with the most disciplined, the most systematic, the most quietly courageous philosophical work of his century. Because he understood that the confusion was not the enemy. The unexamined image was the enemy, and examination was the cure. Your doubt, your confusion, your inability to sustain a picture of God that feels morally monstrous or intellectually insulting. These are not signs that you are losing something sacred. They are signs that the categories you were given are no longer large enough to hold what you are actually experiencing. That is growth. That is precisely the moment when philosophy becomes useful. Not to give you a new dogma, not to replace one authority with another, but to give you a lens clear enough that you can finally look at the question directly, without the distortion of inherited fear. Think about what happens inside you when the image of God is a throne in the sky, a king of infinite power watching your every thought, weighing your every impulse, capable of either saving you or condemning you for eternity. Think about the emotional architecture that image creates. Every mistake becomes evidence of unworthiness. Every doubt becomes a potential sin. Every suffering becomes either a punishment or a test. And every good feeling is shadowed by the question of whether you have truly earned the right to it. This is not faith. This is a very specific emotional structure, and it has a name. Spinoza would call it bondage. The condition in which your inner life is governed by causes outside your understanding. Now shift the image. Imagine not a throne but a storm, not a king deciding but a force unfolding. The lightning does not choose you. The ocean does not punish you. The order of nature does not sit in judgment of your private thoughts. It moves. It follows its own necessity. It produces what its causes demand and holds nothing back out of anger and withholds nothing out of spite. In this image, your suffering still has causes, but those causes are real, traceable, and potentially understandable. You are not being punished. You are inside a causal order that does not negotiate, does not threaten, and does not need your fear to function. Now go deeper. Imagine that the storm is not separate from you, that you are inside it the way a wave is inside the ocean, not abandoned by nature, but made of it. Your body follows the same physical laws as every other body. Your mind operates according to the same causal necessity as every other process in existence. You are not outside of God or nature looking in, hoping to be noticed. You are an expression of it, a finite mode of the infinite substance. This is what Spinoza called you. Not a fallen creature awaiting judgment. Not a stranger in a universe that belongs to someone else, a part of the whole, moving according to necessity, capable of understanding that necessity and capable of finding in that understanding something that feels far more like genuine reverence than terror ever could. Now feel what changes. The guilt that came from imagining a God who expects your perfection. Where does it go when God is the order of nature itself? The fear of eternal punishment. What becomes of it when eternity is not a courtroom but the very fabric of existence? The exhausting vigilance of the person who believes they are always being watched and found wanting. What happens to that vigilance when the watching eye is replaced by the unblinking, impartial, infinitely lawful structure of reality? Something loosens. Something that has been clenched for years, perhaps for a lifetime, begins to open, not into chaos, into clarity. Here is the disruption that Spinoza forces you to face. If God is truly infinite, then God cannot be limited to human categories. God cannot be restricted to human concerns, human preferences, or human political structures. The moment you describe God as being angry, jealous, pleased, or disappointed, you have made God finite. You have made God more like you. And a God made in the image of human authority is not the infinite source of reality. It is a mirror held up to human power and given a divine name. This is not merely a philosophical criticism. It is a moral one. Because a God designed around the need for obedience serves the needs of those who demand obedience. And calling that arrangement divine does not make it true. Spinoza did not miss this. He named it. He traced it through scripture and saw how consistently the portrait of God reflected the social and political needs of the people drawing it. This does not mean the longing for God is false. It does not mean the experience of the sacred is an illusion. It means the container that was handed to you for holding that experience may have been shaped by something other than truth. And you deserve a container large enough for reality. If the idea of God as nature, as infinite, necessary, impersonal order, changes even slightly the way you understand your place in reality, write the word freedom in the comments right now. Not because it is a slogan, because it marks the moment a different kind of thinking became possible for you. The first practice Spinoza's philosophy demands is the most disorienting and the most liberating. Trace where your image of God actually came from, not where you were told it came from. Where it actually originated. Was it fear? Was it a parent who used God as a disciplinary instrument? Was it a community that required a shared image as the price of belonging? Was it scripture read literally before you were old enough to read it critically? Was it the terrifying silence of a prayer that was never answered, and the story you built around that silence to make it bearable? This is not an exercise in cynicism. It is an exercise in intellectual honesty, because Spinoza understood that an emotion governed by a cause you do not see is an emotion that owns you. And an image of God that you have never examined is an image that shapes your entire inner life without your conscious participation. You did not choose that image. It was given to you, often in childhood, often through the people you most needed to trust. And given images, when they are never examined, become invisible architecture. You live inside them without ever noticing the walls. Name the cause. Ask yourself seriously. What experience, what authority, what need, what fear first created the specific portrait of God you carry? When did God become the one who punishes? When did God become the one who is silent? When did God become the source of guilt rather than the source of understanding? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the beginning of philosophy as Spinoza actually practiced it. Not as abstract theory, as the precise, honest examination of the causes that move you. And when you name the cause for the first time, the cause loses some of its invisible power over you. The second step is one that many people fear before they take it and feel liberated after. Separate the pain of your inherited image from the whole of who you are. You are not your fear of God. You are not your guilt. You are not the judgment you absorbed before you had the tools to question it. These were given to you, they shaped you, but they are not the fixed structure of your soul. Spinoza's entire philosophy rests on the understanding that what moves you is not what defines you forever. Understanding changes the relationship, and a changed relationship changes what you are capable of. Some people resist this step because they believe that questioning the inherited image of God means losing the only moral structure they have. They fear that if the God of punishment dissolves, the impulse toward goodness will dissolve with it. But Spinoza understood morality as something that emerges from understanding, not from fear. A person who is good because they are afraid of punishment is not truly virtuous, they are simply afraid. A person who acts with clarity and care because they understand the nature of reality and their place within it. That person is living at a higher level of human freedom. The goodness does not depend on the threat. It emerges from the understanding. You can question the image you were given without questioning the capacity for reverence itself. These are not the same thing. The capacity for reverence, the ability to feel the weight and beauty of existence, the recognition that reality is something far greater than any individual ego. That capacity is not housed inside the specific portrait of an angry God. It is housed inside your own mind, in its ability to encounter reality with adequate ideas rather than fearful imagination. And that capacity does not diminish when the fear goes. It becomes clearer. It becomes more honest. It becomes, in Spinoza's sense, more free. The third step is practical in a way that Spinoza himself would recognize. Choose encounters that increase your understanding rather than your fear. Spinoza believed that what you regularly encounter shapes the emotions you habitually experience. If you surround yourself with imagery, language, and communities that regularly produce guilt, terror, and the sensation of being watched and found inadequate, those emotions will become the landscape of your inner life. They will begin to feel like reality itself rather than like responses to specific causes. And then you will call that inner landscape your relationship with God. Instead, seek encounters with nature itself, not as a religious act, but as a philosophical one. Stand somewhere where the scale of existence becomes undeniable, where the sky is wide enough, or the forest dense enough, or the silence deep enough that the human-shaped image of God begins to look very small by comparison. Let reason work. Read philosophy. Engage with ideas that are larger than inherited comfort. Encounter thinkers who have taken the question of God seriously enough to refuse the easy answer. Let your mind meet the kind of ideas that produce what Spinoza called joy, not the momentary pleasure of distraction, but the deeper expansion that comes when understanding genuinely increases. This is not about replacing one authority with another. It is about diversifying your sources of contact with reality until the full picture becomes visible. A mind that has only ever been given fear-based theology as its lens for understanding the infinite has been given a very narrow window. Widen the window. Read Spinoza. Read the scientists who look at the structure of the universe and feel what can only be called awe. Sit with the question of what reality actually is without needing the answer to confirm what you were already taught. Let the question be genuine. Let the encounter be real. Because real encounters with the actual scale of existence produce something very different from fear. They produce what Spinoza spent his life pointing toward: the intellectual love of what is. The fourth step is the most philosophically demanding, and the one that separates Spinoza's vision most clearly from both naive optimism and passive resignation. It is the practice of accepting necessity without surrendering. Spinoza did not say, "Everything that happens is good, so feel nothing." He said, "Everything that happens follows from causes that are part of the total order of nature." Understanding that order does not mean approving of every outcome. It means relating to reality from a position of clarity rather than a position of illusion. Acceptance of necessity in Spinoza's sense means recognizing that reality does not owe you a different version of itself. It means releasing the particular kind of suffering that comes from demanding that the universe should have arranged itself differently. Not because you stop caring, not because you stop working to change what can be changed, but because the energy you were spending on the impossible fantasy of a different past or a universe that punishes and rewards according to human moral intuitions can be redirected into the genuine task of understanding what is actually true and acting from that understanding. This is where Spinoza's vision of God or nature produces something that fear-based theology promises but cannot fully deliver: genuine peace. Not the peace of ignorance, not the peace of forced acceptance, but the peace of a mind that understands its place inside a necessary order and finds in that place not terror, not abandonment, but the quiet, stable recognition that it belongs to something real. You are a finite mode of an infinite substance. Your existence is not accidental. Your mind is not alien to the universe. The very fact that you can ask these questions, that reason exists inside you and can reach toward understanding, is itself Spinoza's deepest point. The mind that seeks understanding is already participating in what God or nature is. And that participation, rightly understood, is not a burden. It is a form of freedom. Let us name clearly what has been revealed in this conversation. The image of God most people inherit is not derived from the actual infinity of existence. It is derived from human need, human fear, and human authority. It projects onto the universe the emotional architecture of a king and his subjects: reward, punishment, obedience, and terror. And while this image has served social and institutional purposes for centuries, it produces a very specific kind of inner suffering. The suffering of a person who believes the cosmos is watching them with conditional love and the capacity for eternal wrath. Spinoza looked at this directly and refused to pretend it was wisdom. What Spinoza offered in its place is not the cold absence of God, but the radical presence of God or nature. Infinite, necessary, lawful, impartial, and vast beyond the reach of any human projection. In this vision, emotions still have causes, suffering still has weight, but neither is the product of arbitrary divine judgment. You are not being punished. You are inside a causal order that can be understood, and understanding that order, even partially, even imperfectly, is what Spinoza called the highest form of human activity. It is what he called freedom, and it is what he spent his excommunicated, isolated, brilliant life trying to give to every mind willing to receive it. You came into this video perhaps carrying the tension of someone who could not quite believe the inherited portrait of God, and could not quite release it either, caught between the fear of being wrong and the exhaustion of pretending to be certain. That position has a name in Spinoza's philosophy. It is the position of inadequate understanding, not moral failure, not spiritual deficiency. Simply a mind that has not yet been given the full picture. And inadequate understanding can always be replaced by clearer understanding. That is not a promise of perfection. It is a description of how the mind actually works when it is allowed to function without terror. You are invited now to a different position, not the position of the frightened believer trying to satisfy an infinite authority with finite performances, not the position of the reactive skeptic who has simply replaced one fixed certainty with another, but the position of the rational contemplator, the mind that looks at reality with genuine curiosity, that traces causes rather than inventing punishments, that finds in the order of nature not a prison and not an absence, but the only honest form of the sacred that reason can actually touch. That is the identity Spinoza modeled, and it is available to you not as a doctrine to adopt, but as a practice to begin. Remember where this began. Spinoza did not deny God in the simple way many people think. He destroyed a smaller idea of God and replaced it with something far more radical. That destruction was not an act of nihilism, it was an act of intellectual courage. The recognition that the infinite deserves better than a human face painted over it out of fear. The God of nature does not demand your terror. It does not require your performance. It asks only that your mind, when it is ready, open itself to causes rather than curses, to understanding rather than obedience, to the kind of freedom that comes not from being released from reality, but from finally clearly seeing what reality actually is. If this philosophy is one you want to go deeper into, subscribe to Spinoza Reveals. Every video on this channel is built on the same core promise. Spinoza does not offer comfort, he offers understanding, and understanding pursued honestly and without fear is the only form of freedom that cannot be taken from you.